kill me.
Ron Van Clief stands among the pantheon of legendary martial arts actors. A charismatic presence on screen and a legitimate technician of the martial arts off of it. The Van Clief name is respected by Kung Fu fans as well as those in the sporting side of martial arts. While his name may not be as recognized as some of the biggest stars of martial arts, both film and sport, his journey and triumphs helped plant his flag atop the mountain of masters, entertainers, warriors, and survivors. His story is one of exciting highs and horrifying lows, but through it all, Ron Van Clief has proven to be a martial artist in the truest sense of the word. This is the story of the Black Dragon. Ron Van Clief was born in Brooklyn, New York on January 25, 1943 to Larry and Doris Van Clief. As a child, Ron loved comic books and movies, martial arts movies in particular. Whenever his local theater was showing kung fu movies, he and his younger brother would make their way to Chinatown and sneak into showings. Making their way in when crowds were leaving, from an early age, Ron was enamored with martial arts. In 1959, Ron scraped together as much money as he could from various chores and odd jobs to afford martial arts classes. He began training under Grandmaster Moses Powell, the founder of Sanukis Ryu Jiu Jitsu, and once instructor to the FBI and Secret Service. The Sanukis system is a mixed martial art made up of mostly traditional styles with a modern sense of striking. This would have a major impact on Ron Van Clief's perspective of martial arts.
The martial arts, self-defense, karate, jiu-jitsu, what have you, it all gives you a sense of dignity and pride and a lot of confidence. And take, for instance, the black community, my community actually, we have people that are really afraid to come out in the evenings. That's bad because they're part of the community too. And I feel that these particular people should get into martial arts as soon as possible so they can gain more of that dignity and pride and that self-understanding that they're not afraid. If a man or woman can fight back, sometimes they can live longer. So I think the martial arts is like a partner walking down the street with you, and in the black community, you should have it.
In the next year, he was also training in ninjutsu with Ronald Duncan, Shotokan Karate with George Cofield and Tom the Puppet, and Goju Ryu Karate with Peter Urban. Each and every one of his teachers were veterans of the U.S. military, and as the son of a World War II veteran, Ron Van Clief knew where he was going next. In 1960, at age 17, and against his father's disapproval, Ron signed up to the United States Marine Corps. Ron was sent to South Carolina, where he was struck with the culture shock of moving from Brooklyn, New York, to South Carolina in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. In Brooklyn, Ron didn't always feel like a minority. The diversity of cultures and perspectives informed so much of his world, but in South Carolina, he was exposed to a level of violence and hatred that he did not anticipate. Despite Ron quickly adapting to his conditions, his temper and attitude would get the best of him at times. This resulted in fights with fellow Marines who refused to sleep in the same barracks as Ron or the 7 other black recruits. And one day, the decision to stand up for himself would have unforeseen consequences. One fateful day, after a frustrating day of work, Ron decided to take the bus. Ron was tired of being pushed around, and when he refused to sit in the back of the bus, taking his seat towards the front, Ron was arrested. He was released a few hours into the night, collected his belongings and uniform, and when he stepped outside the police station, he found a mob of angry men waiting for him to come out. The men beat Ron within an inch of his life. He lost teeth, they broke his jaw, his left arm, all before tying a rope around his neck and hanging him. Luckily, Ron survived. He spent 4 months in the hospital and half a year on lighter duty before being deployed to various places. He spent time in Fort Lejeune, North Carolina, and was stationed in Guantanamo Bay before making his first trip to the east. Ron was stationed in Okinawa, where he began studying Chinese karate under Tetsuo Shimabuki. He then moved on to the Philippines, where he learned Filipino arts. He spent his remaining time in the Marines stationed in Vietnam, where he served for 14 months, manning M60 machine guns on helicopters and manning artillery. But one day, fate came for Ron once again. While on an everyday run, Ron's helicopter was shot down. A fractured sternum, broken ribs, and several shrapnel wounds would leave Ron in a body cast for 6 weeks. This would be the end of Ron's tour of duty. He was sent home and honorably discharged from the Marines in 1965. He took with him a sharpshooter badge, Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal, a National Service Defense Medal, and PTSD as a result of the events in South Carolina and his tour in Vietnam. Something he struggles with to this very day. After arriving back in the US, Ron worked as a New York City police officer from 1965 to 1968. At the time, Ron continued his passion training and competing in karate. He would expand his training with more styles. Ron went from Taekwondo to Muduk Kwan to Tong Soo Do to Nisei Goju to USA Goju. He competed in both full contact and no contact tournaments in the States and internationally, winning several national tournaments. But in 1966, Ron received some unwanted news. After only 2 years as an airborne paratrooper and 3 months in Vietnam, Ron's brother Pete was killed after running over a landmine. Pete was 22 years old, and he was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart. Pete's death and Ron's own treatment by his superiors and those he was meant to be fighting alongside made Ron feel immensely disillusioned with the US military. He wanted the experience of all of his mentors. Instead, he saw similar experiences to that of his father, whose time as a merchant marine in World War II drove him to addiction as a way of coping with trauma. While the 60s were a time of great stress for Ron Van Clief, his decade would end in much higher spirits. In 1969, Ron would attend an important tournament. The Japanese Exposition was held at New York Coliseum, and it is here where Ron won his first World Karate Championship. He took first place in the middleweight division and second place in the black belt kata. Ron quickly followed up the Japanese Exposition with a tournament at Madison Square Garden. And while he may have ended that tournament in second place, he impressed someone in the audience. Bruce Lee was awestruck with Ron's technique and speed. The two met and became friends, and it was Bruce who bestowed upon Ron a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: the Black Dragon. The 1970s would be a major career change for Ron, but on January 25, 1971, Ron founded the Chinese Goju system. A short explanation. The term Goju has two contrasting meanings: Go, hard, and Ju, soft. Think of the Chinese ideology of yin and yang. The two must exist for a sense of harmony and balance. Ron wanted to combine his many years training in Japanese and Chinese styles, as well as blend with an American technical sensibility. The soft, open hand, defensive movements come together with Japanese hard offensive strikes to make up the Chinese Goju system. The 70s started pretty well, but it was time for Ron Van Clief to make another journey east. The source of Ron's passion for martial arts is rooted in Kung Fu cinema. So Ron decided to make his way east to Hong Kong. In 1973, Ron auditioned for the Yangtze production studio. After impressing the studio heads, he was given a 5-picture deal, the first starring alongside Jason Pai Piao in the aptly named The Black Dragon.
After the death of the Dragon comes a new American superstar, 16 years in the martial arts, 7th degree black belt, and 4 times world champion. Introducing Ron Van Clief as the Black Dragon. We said enough. Now we'll let him do the talking.
Are you crazy?
The Black Dragon. Rougher, tougher, and stronger than anything you've seen before.
While Ron doesn't take the lead role in the film, His martial skill and charisma won fans in the studio over enough to give him his own lead roles. Ron Van Clief had become the first foreigner to play the lead role in a Hong Kong film. Over the decade, Ron starred in around a dozen films. According to Ron, he was able to do so many films in such a short time because each one only took about 2 weeks to shoot. Finish with one, start another. These films may not have reached the mass appeal that other kung fu films in the 70s did, but when they played in those same theaters that Ron and his brother would sneak into, the right audience found what they were looking for. And more people would find them with kung fu theater on Saturday afternoons in the 70s and 80s. When Ron was a kid, movies inspired him. Now his movies were speaking to a new generation of black kids. Now you would think that Ron would take a break from fighting while deep into his acting career, but you would be wrong. Ron had been quite fed up with the American karate tournaments at the time. He felt the style of competition wasn't legit enough, and if a specific organization was running the tournament, then they would rig it so that their preferred competitor would win. But the tournaments hosted in Hong Kong in the 70s were a completely different game. No more point karate. This was a full contact fight, last man standing. The only thing separating this from modern day mixed martial arts is that no one knew what ground game was yet. But Ron would jump at any opportunity to test his skill as a martial artist, something he would live by again in the 90s. Ron Van Clief was not in love with the movie-making world. Ron is a martial artist first and an actor second, and what he found in the Hong Kong film industry was that his co-stars were oftentimes not just actors before martial artists, but they were just actors. Ron appreciated the opportunity and the recognition his films gave him, but into the 80s, his attention would often shift into publishing a book or two. 1981's Manual of the Martial Arts, 1984's White Belt Guidebook, and Green and Purple Belt Guidebook, and eventually 1995's The Black Heroes of Martial Arts. The 80s saw his film career continue in front of and behind the camera, and he even picked up a protege in both film and martial arts. The Last Dragon himself, Tai Mok. In 1984, Ron was inducted into the All-American Hall of Fame. He would finish out the 80s teaching, continuing to compete, and appearing in films like Riot on 42nd Street. The 90s saw an aging Ron Van Clief take on his greatest test yet. Ron Van Clief is as legit a martial artist as one could be. He's a fighter who is looking to test his art and his skill in any way possible. And the 90s saw the introduction of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. A very different Ultimate Fighting Championship than we have today, but the Ultimate Fighting Championship nonetheless. And despite the words of warning from veterans like Superfoot Bill Wallace, Ron craved the competition. He saw the UFC as the only true test of fighting. And in 1994, at the age of 51, Ron Van Clief competed at UFC 4. In the first round, Ron was paired up against the top name in UFC so far, 27-year-old Royce Gracie. After 2 minutes, Ron was submitted. To this day, Ron is the oldest person to ever compete in the UFC. Ron took the loss in stride. As a true student of martial arts with a background in several styles, Ron saw his loss as an introduction to a new chapter in his life of martial arts. Ron took a brief retirement from competition for the rest of the decade, as he became the commissioner and recruiter of the UFC, as well as an instructor to the US Secret Service. But the new millennium and reaching his 60s could not stop Ron Van Clief as he returned to competition in 2002. At 60 years old, Ron won first place in the 2002 All-American Karate Championship. This marked the end of Ron Van Clief's illustrious competitive career. Okay, well, that isn't the whole truth. This marked the end of Ron's competitive karate career. Soon after this, Ron began training in no-gi Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, the same style that had bested him at UFC 4. And in 2012, Ron began training under the very family name that submitted him, Royce's brother, Helson Gracie. At 80 years old, Ron currently holds a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and has earned several silver medals from competitions. He has yet to capture the gold. I don't have any gold medals yet in Jiu Jitsu, though I've won 6 silver and 3 bronze. But there's never anybody in my age division, so I have to compete in the younger one. My goal is to get my black belt and compete one more time as a black belt. I will compete as a black belt. Ron's greatest challenge didn't come on the mat or on camera. The trauma Ron experienced in his younger years, both in South Carolina and Vietnam, has followed him into today. Ron has frequently struggled with PTSD, affecting his sleep and his personal life. But no, Ron Van Clief has never let that get in his way. Ron has fought through the adversity of his struggles with mental health, becoming a 5-time World Karate Champion, a 15-time All-American Champion, a Black Belt Magazine Hall of Famer, a member of the International Sports Hall of Fame, the first foreigner to lead a Hong Kong film. He earned his black belt in Sanukas, 5th Dan in Shotokan, 9th Dan in American Goju, 2nd Dan in Karate, 8th Dan in Aikijutsu, studied Wing Chun, and most recently gained his purple belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And of course, founded his own style in the Chinese Goju system. But above his personal and career achievements is the effect he had on others. His on-screen persona and work on over 100 films has influenced martial artists throughout the decades. The Black Dragon, along with blaxploitation films of Jim Kelly, are the start of a chain reaction that led to films like The Last Dragon and the work of Michael Jai White like Blood and Bone and Black Dynamite. But away from the screen, Ron Van Clief is a mentor to thousands around the world. Ron has lived, taught, and trained across the globe. In his time, he has seen over 500,000 students come through his doors. Anyone who has had even the bare minimum of martial arts taught to them understands the confidence, security, and sense of self that can give someone. Ron has helped over 500,000 people from continent to continent achieve that confidence and gain that security. Add in the people who have been inspired by his films for one reason or another, and I couldn't even begin to count the amount of people whose lives Ron has impacted. Ron Van Clief's story is one of exciting highs and horrifying lows. He spent his entire life fighting in one way or another. He fought for his country and his brothers in arms, even if that country or those brothers never showed much care for him. He fought for his life, both in the jungles of Vietnam and the streets of South Carolina. But for Ron Van Clief, fighting is what drove him. His passion for martial arts became the driving force of his entire life, whether it was fighting on screen like his childhood heroes, or fighting on the mat like his real-life mentors. Ron Van Clief is a martial artist in the very truest sense of the word. And the most beautiful part of his entire story, from his achievements in Hong Kong cinema to his accolades in the sport he has devoted his life to, is that Ron Van Clief is still that kid who grew up in Brooklyn, New York, sneaking into cinemas with his brother and learning from Moses Powell and Peter Urban. Despite all the miles traveled, despite the loss he has suffered, and the scars he bear mentally or physically, Ron Van Clief never gave up on that one thing he discovered all those decades ago.